welcome back to the show. It's I think this is the home stretch, Tessa. We're having a great day today.
Fantastic.
And it's just
so glad to be here.
It's just about to get better because we've got James Wigmore joining us, and James is a forensic toxicologist.
That's correct. Toxicology is the science of drugs and poisons and their adverse effects on the human body. And forensic means I go to court a lot, or coroner's inquest, any medical, legal situation that involves the drugs.
Right, okay. So, and you've written this book, Wigmore on alcohol, and this one, Wigmore on cannabis. And I think it's a very timely that you're here because let's talk about the cannabis more because we already know about
everyone
alcohol.
Knows what we should know about alcohol.
Yeah. But this cannabis thing, it's legal now, and
no, not quite. October 17th.
Yes.
But you can still go to a store and buy it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what's going on, but I mean, it's well, we were just chatting before we came on, and you were saying that there's actually a lot of similarities between cannabis and alcohol. But the one thing you mentioned that I'd actually heard of before is that the THC is fat soluble.
Yes.
Whereas the alcohol is water soluble, so the THC gets stored in your body longer. Is that correct?
That's correct. Like the other interesting thing too is that both the active ingredient in alcoholic beverages and the active ingredient in cannabis are alcohols, basically. The active ingredient that causes the impairment in alcoholic beverages is actually called ethanol. And you can tell it's an alcohol by the OL ending. The active psychoactive ingredient of cannabis is tetrahydrocannabinol. Again, an OL ending, meaning it's an alcohol. The difference is that ethanol is a 2-carbon alcohol, which is very water soluble, so your body can get rid of it very quickly, just like it can get rid of nicotine quickly and caffeine quickly. Whereas, as you indicated, tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is a large 21-carbon alcohol, which is fat soluble. So once it's in the body has a hard time getting rid of fat-soluble compounds. It's the same thing as trying to get rid of DDT. DDT is highly fat-soluble, and some other compounds. So you're right. That's a major difference is that the THC will remain in your body longer than the ethanol will.
Now, it may remain in your body, but does it remain like psychoactive, or is it can it
impact your performance in any way?
Impact your performance or your health in ways that people might not think, because the next day they wake up, they might feel okay, or maybe the day after that. But is there ways that it's affecting people that they may not be aware of?
Well, cannabis, or marijuana basically, is a very complicated plant. It produces, there's about 400 different cannabinoids.
Yeah.
The one we're concerned with from a forensic and toxicology point of view is THC. That's the one that causes the impairment, the addiction, the high, all the impaired driving and things like that. The other cannabinoids may have benefits or risks which we're not aware of. The one cannabinoid in the marijuana, which is under a lot of investigation, which has some health benefits potentially, is called CBD, or cannabidiol. So basically, you should think of the cannabis as consisting of 2 parts: THC, which gives the high and causes the impairment, and CBD, which doesn't cause any impairment and actually mitigates or decreases the effects of THC.
Well, you can even buy now, so I've heard, strains of marijuana that are really concentrating on the CBD rather than the THC.
Yeah, actually that's what they used to do years ago. It's called hemp. Hemp is a type of cannabis which just grows CBD. If you try to smoke hemp, all you get is a headache because it doesn't have any THC or no. So yeah, we've been growing hemp. Actually, hemp is legal in Canada for maybe 30 years, and Canadians have been growing it and shipping it to the States, especially the hemp seeds.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Well, hemp is, I mean, what a great crop because, first of all, you can grow it anywhere in the country, pretty much, right? On some of the worst land that might not support anything. I think it actually cleans up the soil. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure about that, yeah.
But anyways, and it has so many uses. But the CBD, does it have some positive? Because I've heard that it has positive medical characteristics.
Yes, it does. For one thing, again, it doesn't cause a high. So if you're taking CBD, you won't be impaired, and actually you will pass all the tests. So if you were taking CBD and driving, and the police stopped you and did tests, mainly oral fluid and blood tests, you would pass it because it wouldn't detect the THC. It wouldn't detect THC. Like all the police are interested in, and toxicology are interested in, is the THC, which causes the impairment.
Yeah.
So CBD is relatively harmless, at least from causing impairment. It also has been shown to help in refractory childhood epilepsy.
Okay.
So childhood epilepsy is a very serious disease, and there's about 20 legal drugs which pharmacy companies have developed to help prevent epilepsy. Refractory means the child doesn't respond to any of those drugs.
Right.
So they have the seizures, which are really bad. So what happens if you have hemp oil or basic CBD oil, that is in about maybe 80% of the people of the children who don't respond to the regular drugs will respond to CBD, and it will reduce their epilepsy. So there's that benefit, and there seems to be other benefits too, health benefits.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about the driving. Obviously, alcohol and driving don't go very well together. But cannabis seems a little bit, well, I mean, actually you mentioned, I think before we came on, it's not as bad for driving as alcohol, but it's hard to, I don't know, it seems hard to measure how much is too much. Some people seem to get used to cannabis and operate all day long on it sometimes.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's just like alcohol-dependent people. Some of them become so tolerant to alcohol that they can drink maybe a 26 or a 40 ouncer a day and seem not to function. It's just that when it comes to a complex task such as driving, where there's all sorts of unexpected things happening. I mean, basically, with cannabis and with alcohol, you're basically operating the car under autopilot. So as long as there's nothing unusual happening, if you've driven the same route all the time and there's nothing like a ball bounces in front of you and a kid runs in front of you, if it's usual, then you probably get home okay. But it's when you need to switch out of autopilot to
adapt
it's like
to
emergency situation,
right,
that alcohol really causes impairment, and so does THC to a extent. But just to get the numbers across, just to show you that one large study in the United States looking at the incidence of the drug in fatality. So this is the drug causing the traffic fatality. They found that if you have THC in your system, you're twice as likely to be involved in a traffic fatality. So there is an increased risk. If you have alcohol in your system, you're 16 times as likely to be involved in an accident. So much, much greater risk than with THC. THC is still a risk, but alcohol is a much, much worse risk.
Alcohol, you can get to a state with alcohol where you just can't drive even on autopilot.
Yeah, that's true. Then the other thing, which is another area to get into, is a combination of alcohol and THC. So if you combine alcohol and THC, you're 25 times as likely to be involved. So it goes from 2 times as likely with THC, 16 times as likely with alcohol, and 25 times as likely with alcohol and THC. So never mix those two drugs together.
So you pretty much double your
the
trajectory rate.
The other thing I heard is, and this has got nothing to do with driving, but if you're going to mix them, you want to start with the THC. You want to start with the THC, then add alcohol. You don't want to
start with alcohol and then
end it on THC.
Well, can I use an old slang, a swear word, basically?
Okay.
Beer before grass, you're on your ass. Grass before beer, you're in the clear.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So, yeah, it's
It
even rhymes.
Common folk
Complimentary
knowledge.
Yeah, beer before grass, you're on your ass. I guess you didn't know that old saying.
Well,
in the 60s and 70s, you used to know that.
There you go. Like it came from. It started with the
grass
hippies.
Before beer, you're in the clear.
That's awesome. Woodstock. Yeah.
Well, the reason for that is because if you consume alcohol before you take cannabis, alcohol will cause your THC levels to elevate. So there's an interaction that way.
For sure.
So if you're used to a certain type of cannabis you're smoking without any beer or any other drug, you'll have a much greater effect of alcohol.
Okay, so let's talk about legalization for a sec.
Yeah.
And because Canada now, I just heard, it's going to be the second G or whatever.
No, the first G7 country.
Okay, first G7. I think Portugal is the only other country that's legalized it in I don't know, in the West.
I think it's Bolivia. It's the only.
Okay, Bolivia. But I mean, but now we're a rogue nation. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah,
but I mean, what are the implications for a society that has legalized cannabis? I just find it interesting because, like, for example, the cannabis issue kind of I think, hit the public dialogue really in the 60s, to the point where it was like there was a new generation that was using cannabis and an older generation that predominantly had not. That was the generation gap. And
it was like they said in the Vietnam War. Actually, it's funny, the wars for like increased drug use. The Vietnam War, all the officers were using booze all the time.
Yeah.
You know, they had the blenders and that, and drinking to cope with the stress.
Right.
All the quote grunts or the lower people were using cannabis, which they got available from Thailand and all sorts of other places too. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Well, I think the problem is, actually, it's interesting. The drug in the 60s and 70s, and our Ledane Commission, which looked into drug use, found that cannabis at that time was a relatively safe drug because it had low THC levels and very high CBD levels. So the CBD would decrease the risk of psychosis of THC, and the THC was relatively low. So basically, I think most rational people would be against decriminalization. And that means that the person would not get a criminal record just for having some cannabis. That's the rational way of going. What we're doing is one step further, not only decriminalizing it, but also legalizing it. So it means that you can produce it, you can sell it, you can do it's all legal. Whereas decriminalization just means possession of it. You wouldn't have a criminal record, which is a great thing. I don't think that people should have a criminal record for having small amounts of cannabis. The problem will be not with really so much as the legalization, but I think the commercialization. Commercialization, and there's all sorts of, and these companies are no longer small mom and pop things, they're billion-dollar companies. And of course what they want to do is sell the most cannabis they can possible. And so they want to start commercializing it, have, branding the different things, and pushing it like tobacco's done. I mean, alcohol and tobacco are big billion-dollar companies that push their drugs. And cannabis will be pushing there. So rather than seeing, say, a Joe Camel, you'll see a Joe Cannabis.
Well, don't we see this right now in the pharmaceutical industry? I mean, there are all types of, and I think if we're looking at cannabis, sure, there's a recreational component, but there's a huge push right now in the medical market around cannabis being the thing to address this opioid scare around pain management. So,
well, not just that. I've seen it recommended as a treatment for people recovering from crystal meth addiction, even.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's like the papers I read. It's ambiguous whether it can. I mean, the problem with cannabis is that, unlike the prescription drugs, it has never been evaluated properly by a scientific thing. I mean, basically, it was voted in communities, or with us in 2001, I think it was, the Supreme Court of Canada decision allowed medical use of cannabis, and that's how we got cannabis introduced. And once you had the medical use, it's like a Trojan horse. The same thing happened with alcohol and prohibition, and it broke the prohibition, which I think is, if commercialization can be controlled, if the marketing can be controlled properly, like it took us 50 years to control tobacco, if it can be controlled properly, then legalization will be a good thing, because basically we have our head in the sand and trying to ignore this issue. Whereas what we need is the science out there. Let's see what's happening. Let's see what recommendations we can make to people. Let's see how we can reduce risk.
Well, I agree with you. I think one of the things that we've seen as this generation, we've seen the impact of the prohibition of alcohol, and we've seen the impact of lots of other things in our market when it comes to the pharmaceutical prescription of different drugs. So it's not our first rodeo around different types of drugs that come to market that we have a real opportunity to change the game. Like, look at Viagra, what Viagra did in the 90s, right? So similarly with cannabis, what can we do then, given sort of, you talk about the commercialization, to put some infrastructure in place to support the education around this regulatory piece? Like we were talking about before the show, harm reduction. What are some of the other things that can be integrated so that we do a better job of educating the market on this drug?
Yeah, You're right. I think it's mainly as you said, education, and I've been trying to do some of that. Like I've been going around to the various Toronto public libraries doing lectures on Not Your Granddad's Weed, the forensic science of cannabis, showing how cannabis has evolved with time and what are the risks and potential problems with cannabis use. And I think we have to get rid of, say, a lot of it is subjective. So people will say, well, I smoked this type of weed, 9-pound hammer or Gorilla Glue, and it cured me of my back pain or something. And again, that's all, just one case or something. You have to do more extensive studies.
I agree.
With the legalization, perhaps the scientists now will not have their hand tied behind their backs and actually can do studies with cannabis to see which cannabinoids are good, which ones don't cause impairment, which ones could potentially benefit us.
I'd like to know what the benefits of Trainwreck and Pink Lizard are.
Silver haze.
Yeah, I don't think those are prescription drugs. I don't think you go to the pharmacist and say like, Gorilla.
Well, I'm
They're
heavily
not designed for
No.
for medical reasons.
for sure. Well, I'm heavily involved in the cannabis area, and with a lot of the physicians that are advocating for this being part of a discipline for change. And one of the things that keeps coming up in conversation is pharmacogenomic prescription of cannabis. So having it become so like the strain differentiation and the levels of THC and CBD becoming so well known that you can actually
quantify the dose.
Yeah,
right?
and make it so that your strain is customized to really meet your diagnosis. But again, education and then commercialization, like a real-time research project needs to be done to be able to do that. Or you tell me, what are your thoughts on that pharmacogenomic prescription?
Well, it's kind of interesting, but my understanding of the cannabis plant, it's a wonderful plant. I mean, it's thousands of years of evolution, and it's highly variable. So basically, you can grow cannabis plants beside each other under identical conditions, and one will have a high THC, and the other one will have a lower THC. They're within a range. So the problem with medical use of cannabis is that the strains, even in the South, vary in a lot of the concentration. So if you found one cannabis plant that helped you on something, if you try to get the same thing the next week or so, it's going to be different. So there's a problem. The other problem is the dose administration currently is with smoking it. That introduces other health risks like emphysema. Supposedly it's not as cancer-causing as tobacco, but there are other medical conditions. You get the cough in the morning, you get emphysema. So they potentially vaping may be a better way of administering for medical purposes. And supposedly that's the number one route for people who currently are prescribed it for medicine is by vaping. Vaping basically doesn't burn the cannabis. It causes it to be vaping or causes it to be at a much lower temperature, so it's not burning or oxidizing. Right now, if you smoke it, you're burning the cannabis, you're oxidizing it, you're causing all sorts of potentially carcinogenic and bad compounds. With the vaping, you're just getting at an elevated temperature, so you're not burning the compound, and you can inhale it. So that's a potential. The other potential is they do have some oral drugs available currently, even in Canada right now, like drobolone or Marinol, which you can get by prescription, which may have some interesting effects, and they're better controlled. Yeah, there's a lot to think about it. There's so many in the areas, but that's why I always like to compare it to alcohol, because after Prohibition, we had all sorts of problems with alcohol, and then finally we got the laws changed. We can do breath alcohol testing. We have a variation law. We know about the problems of alcohol addiction and the problems of youth. Basically, that's the problem with all drugs. Cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco. The younger the person starts, the more likely they're going to be adverse effects. So we have to keep the age they start higher.
I agree with that. It's just the other piece to it is I look at the flip side of this is the medical market for pharmaceuticals that have a toxicology sort of impact on the body. And so, when you speak to cannabis, tobacco, and alcohol, it's like you're grouping these three substances into one area that has largely been sort of, fringe on the sort of controlled substance abuse thing, or uncontrolled substance abuse thing, and then we've got the pharmaceutical market, which, to be honest, in my mind, kind of lines up with like that same sort of level of like, you know, our capacity to like abuse. And so so how, I guess, you know, the thing is, in this something to think about when we're talking about commercializing and dosing and all the rest of it, what's a way forward around being able to do a better job introducing cannabis from from a regulatory perspective versus like what we've seen in the pharmaceutical market when it comes to research?
Well, I think, again, the legalization will help. And basically, if a drug gives you a high, it's not a good drug, basically. So the opioids are a problem. They may relieve your back pain, but they give you a high and they cause addiction and eventually can cause death. The good thing about cannabis is, unlike alcohol and the opioids, cannabis won't cause your heart to stop beating and your lungs to stop functioning. Like cannabis, when it comes to overdoses and fatalities, basically overdose is basically psychosis and behavioral problems, as opposed to someone dying because their heart stops. Where alcohol will stop your heart from beating and you from breathing. So it is safer that way. So basically what the pharmaceutical company has to look at is these 400 different other cannabinoids and design a pill or a drug or whatever which doesn't cause a high, doesn't cause addiction. Because, I mean, if I'm taking if I want to, say, relieve, say, an antibiotic, relieve an infection. You know, when you take antibiotics, you don't want an antibiotic that gets you spacey all the time. You take the antibiotic, you don't feel anything, and it stops the problem. So the same thing will have to be with the cannabinoids. Reduce the potential of a high, which would cause also potential for addiction, which we've seen with the opioids, and solve the medical problem without causing impairment.
Right, so it's more of an issue around extracting sort of standard levels of... And
then administering to different patients and following up on them and seeing what side effects there are, just like any other regular drug. Basically, cannabis is short-circuited with our Supreme Court decision. Again, it wasn't like our Health Canada, did a study and said this is okay. It's basically the Supreme Court said you must allow medical use for cannabis.
Let me ask you about... I don't know if your background as a forensic toxicologist would inform you about this, but now that it's legal or going to become legal, do you think it will increase the incidence of use? Do you think people,
It probably will, because it'll be readily available. Basically...
Because we hear stories now of construction workers smoking weed on the job, or police officers...
well, that's the edibles.
Yeah, well, it's still, do we want that, right?
Yeah. Again, it's part of the education with people that cannabis is not a safe, harmless drug, that if you should not use it in any situation where you're dealing with heavy equipment or machinery or driving. And also, cannabis will last, again, because it's fat soluble, will last longer in the body. Yeah. So if you're saying have a glass of wine, just one glass of wine, if you're not like an alcohol dependent person, so you have a glass of wine over lunch, basically you have a little bit of a feeling of a buzz, you eat the meal, talk with people, and basically within an hour after the meal, there's no effects of alcohol on the person. If you smoke a joint, you'll have a buzz for 2 to 4 hours and potential impairment greater than that. The Family College of Physicians in Canada is the only one I've seen that made recommendations that do not use a car after 4 hours if you smoke it, 6 hours if you eat it, or 8 hours if you feel a high. Mm-hmm. And that looks like it's not too bad a recommendation. Whereas with alcohol, 1 drink an hour, basically, say you're okay.
Right. Now, of course, we know that excessive alcohol consumption can put long-term stress on the liver.
Yeah.
Right? Is there a similar health risk associated with cannabis?
Again, it depends on how you use it. So if you're smoking it, you'll have other health risks associated with smoke in the lungs, so
right.
emphysema. And again, cancer doesn't seem to be as great a rate. The main problem, I think, with THC compared to alcohol is psychosis, especially long-term psychosis. Typically, the psychosis is basically a complex mental disorder which you lose touch of reality. So you have disorganized thinking, disorganized talking, you have hallucinations. And typically with cannabis, it only happens when the THC level is relatively high, and once you calm down after about 4 hours, it disappears. But supposedly if you keep using, especially high THC cannabis like skunk, you have a greater potential of having long-term psychosis. It doesn't go away.
Like I said, I prior to the show, I have lived experience with this, with a very close family member having a psychotic break after being trained as like a high-performance athlete for most of his life, and had this psychotic experience using cannabis to heal from a terrible injury.
Yeah.
And to address some of the pain instead of taking opioids. And so had this psychotic challenge, and it really sent us down a loop of really, understanding a new way that cannabis can really impact our psychology. I've had first-hand experience of this, and I think this is an area that really needs to be addressed, and it's something I have to say that I find really interesting that now, like you mentioned around the college, the CPSO giving guidelines around when to use cannabis, or how, that wasn't necessarily given with Percocet in a sense, right? Or maybe a little bit, but when it comes to this piece around psychosis, what do you think can be done, I guess, around the integration of cannabis and how to educate around this particular piece?
Yeah, well, basically what you'd want, especially if you're starting up with using cannabis, you should go for the low THC concentration and the high CBD concentration. So basically when the stores start selling it in Ontario, they'll have all the different strains listed, and they'll list the THC and they'll list the CBD. So especially if I was just starting up, I wouldn't go for the 30% skunk or sinsemilla, which had low CBD, because that would have a great potential for causing psychosis. I would go for a strain that's maybe 5 or 6% THC and a high CBD concentration. And don't smoke the whole joint, just smoke a bit and titrate yourself to see what the effects are. But that is a risk of cannabis, which you don't get with alcohol. But with alcohol, as you said, we have the cirrhosis of the liver, which cannabis doesn't seem currently to cause long-term liver damage.
Are you finding that a lot of the LPs and the producers of cannabis right now are doing enough to educate the market on some of the areas, like some of the challenges around toxicology and the awareness of toxicology that we need to have around the regulation of this drug?
My feeling, I don't have much really dealing with them, but my feeling is that they want to promote the product. So you don't want to talk about the risk. They seem to be a bit like the tobacco industry and the alcohol industry. Like if you go to the LCBO, I'm always shocked when I go there. I mean, alcohol is a very problematic drug. You go to the LCBO, you don't see a single warning anywhere. There's no warnings in the bottles about what the proper risks are. It's like you're going to a candy store. And my main concern is if cannabis starts to become that way, where you don't have any warnings. Supposedly there'll be warnings on the packages, but if we put warnings on cannabis, we should put also warning on the alcohol bottles too.
So in general, though, what's your kind of bottom line assessment of legalization in Canada?
I think if it's properly controlled, if they have the proper legislation and they can control the excessive commercialization, I think it will be to a benefit. Because again, we'll be able to look at the scientific aspects of cannabis, see again what the risks are, and mitigate the risks. I mean, right now we don't know. We've heard this, and this happened in Colorado, this happened in Washington. You don't really see that because again, it's not totally legal in Colorado and Washington because federally it's still illegal. So it's still, we're the first country
that has the connection between the provinces, essentially, the states and the federal government.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm optimistic if it can be regulated, but if it's not enacted properly, it could be a big flop, a big failure, and we're basically doing an experiment.
What would be the negative consequences of a huge flop?
Negative consequences would be a large increase in use of cannabis, increase in admissions to hospital for psychosis, which would cause greater waiting periods, waiting time for the other people who have other problems. Underage use, teenage use of it, which would lead to addiction and cannabis use disorder. Increase in traffic accidents, increase in suicides, and all sorts of other problems. But again, that's all part with not education. That I mean, if the person goes in the store, they turn 19, I'll get 9-pound gorilla, 30% THC. No, so who cares? What's CBD? I don't even know what that is. And smoke a whole thing of it and combine it with alcohol, we will have problems.
Well, I think that, thank you so much for this, James, because I feel that, this is a conversation, a larger conversation that we can have around harm reduction and education around stimulants or self-regulating or self-medicating stimulants. I mean, we can do this for coffee, tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, pharmaceuticals, but it's definitely part of a larger conversation for this generation.
Yes, that's right. That's great.
That now I think more people are open to having.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
So James, here are the books again. Where can people get who should read these books, and where can they get their hands on them?
Basically, they're written for forensic toxicology, mainly for lawyers, but lawyers don't know much about science anyways. So basically, even the layperson would find it very, very interesting. And you can get it on my website, www.wigmoreonalcohol.com. And I didn't have to change the name of the website because, as I said, THC is also an alcohol.
Right.
So it'll be alcohol and cannabis. You get it there, or you can get it from my publisher, Irwin Law.
Great.
Wonderful.
Well, it's been great to have you on the show.
Thank you, and welcome back again.
Yeah.
We would love
More
to have you
issues
back.
to cover, too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
We're just getting started.
Oh, boy. Oh, yes. I'm thinking of some topics right now. So, wigmoreonalcohol.com. People can get the books there.
Thank you very much.
Find out more. Okay, great. Great to have this conversation. Okay, Tess, I think that's it for the show today.
Wow, thanks, Hugh. It was
Yeah, it
awesome
was
to
good.
be here after Canada Days.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, I guess we'll say bye for now. We'll be back tomorrow at 1 for more Liquid Lunch. And tonight, Crypto Bay at 7 o'clock, live here on thatchannel.com. Oh, I want to say hi to Ernest, who's tuning in from Ottawa. Hi, Ernest. Okay. We'll see you next time, thatchannel.com.